Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week here at the Things That Don't Change for the 19th week in Ordinary Time. Now, as always, we're going to get right into things today. Got a couple of saints to go through. First saint that we have is Saint Clare of Assisi. So Saint Clare was born on the 16th of July in the year 1194 in Assisi, which is in Italy. And she was born Chiara o Ferduccio. She was the eldest daughter to two wealthy parents. Of a ancient noble family from that area, and from a very young age, she dedicated herself to prayer. She became aware of Saint Francis of Assisi at age of 18 when he came to preach at the Lenten service at her parish. It was here that she asked him, how best can I live the gospel? She kind of wanted his advice on how to live a holy life, and through this act, he called her to kind of join up with his own movement. So on Palm Sunday in the year 1212, right after the Lent of this service, she left home to kind of go join up with the burgeoning Franciscan movement, centered around, of course, Saint Francis. She cut her hair, began wearing, kind of a very modest robe and veil, kind of living that very austere life. She joined the Benedictine nuns of San Paolo and Bastia. And when her father found out what she had done, where she was going to spend the rest of her life, he attempted to force her to come home. But she declared that she had no other spouse but Christ. Of course, as the eldest daughter of a noble family, it was expected that she would get married. But this wasn't something that she felt called to, because she knew that Christ wanted her to, live as a religious. So her sister Caterina actually also came to join the same convent sometime later. She became Sister Agnes. And the both of them moved to a new convent set up near San Damiano, near kind of where St. Francis's headquarters was around that time. And as the time went on, more and more women came to join the community, really interested and willing to live a life close to the Lord, away from kind of the wealth. They didn't wear shoes, they didn't eat meat, they were mostly silent and throughout the day, and just lived very simply. They lived according to the rule of St. Francis. And this kind of subset, this order that Saint Clare now found herself in charge of, started to become known as the Order of the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. Clare became the first abbess of that. This of course later became the Order of Saint Clare after her death, but at this point they were just known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. So several years after this, Saint Francis died, and of course. This was a very difficult moment for the community because of this. The sisters, including St. Clare, had been taking care of St. Francis, in his later years as he, became ill. However, after he died, a lot of the surrounding clergy, kind of wanted to force them back into a more Benedictine spirituality, right? I mean, when they first joined this order, it was a Benedictine, order that they had joined. However, they had kind of started to stray into this more Franciscan spirituality. So, a lot of the higher ups wanted them to kind of go back to the Benedictine disciplines. However, St. Clare resisted a lot of these attempts and continued to really push forward for living as this community of Franciscan nuns. She became kind of known as another Francis just for many of the similarities that existed between her and St. Francis. She was known for her great asceticism and prayer. In the year 1224, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II came to Assisi while he was at war. And of course, a lot of the people of the town were really nervous about how this invading army would, treat the people, and, that they might, attack and destroy the town. However, Clare, who at this time was very sick, came out with the Blessed Sacrament to meet the soldiers who were showing up, and just, prayed for deliverance to the people, so that that they would stave their destruction of Assisi. And at the sight of the Blessed Sacrament, the attackers were kind of faltered in their war-centered mindset, and were struck with fear and just ended up leaving the sisters leaving the city alone. So she lives here for many more years, at her convent, continuing building her order. In the year 1253, Pope Innocent IV officially gave papal permission for Clare's rule to kind of govern this order. So, at this point now they had that papal stamp of approval that they were allowed to kind of keep doing what they were doing, and they didn't have to go back to the Benedictine way or anything like that. So it was actually only 2 days after she got this permission that she passed away on August the 11th of 1253. She was 59 years old at this time. Pope Innocent was quick to have her canonized, and she was officially declared a saint only 2 years later in 1255 under the next pope, who was Pope Alexander IV. The Basilica of St. Clare in Assisi was completed in the year 1260, and her remains are entombed there until this day. And she She was actually made patron saint of the television, of all things, by Pope Pius XII in 1958. And the reasoning for this was due to the fact that, an old story of her goes back that when she became too ill later in life, was not unable to attend Mass sometimes, she was bedridden. She was actually kind of miraculously able to see and hear Mass kind of from the wall of her room. So kind of this mystical analogy of kind of what the television is the reason why Pope Pius XII decided to make her the patron saint of that. So, as I mentioned, she died in 1253, and her feast day is on the day that she passed away, August the 11th. The next saint that we have is Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. So Saint Jane was born on the 23rd of January in the year 1572 in Dijon in France. And she was the daughter of a high-ranking local noble. Her mother died when she was very young, so primarily throughout her life she was raised by her father to be a courtly lady. In the year 1592, she married the Baron Christophe de Chantal, and the couple ended up having 6 children, half of which survived infancy. The family also cared for the children of Jane's sister Margaret, who had been deceased for some years. So again, it was a very full household with a lot of children running about. Jane carefully managed her husband's affairs, as the Baron. She also provided alms and care to needy neighbors. And in the year 1601, her husband actually passed away in a hunting accident. So she was widowed at the young age of 28. So kind of left now to take care of her children without her husband still around. She took a vow of chastity at this time, and kind of, vowed not to remarry or anything like that, and just to continue, living as a mother to her children after her husband's death. She struggled to forgive the man at first who accidentally killed her husband. It had been a hunting accident, so the man didn't obviously mean to do it, but inadvertently, her husband died as a result of the accident. But she continued to kind of have those lingering feelings of just betrayal from that man. Her husband on his deathbed forgave the man who had shot him. However, even Jane herself was finally able to kind of find forgiveness for this guy. In the year 1602, she and her children moved to Montholon to live with her father-in-law. And now as a widow, she kind of devoted herself more to spiritual matters. So she met the Bishop of Geneva, who at this time was Francis de Sales. And, he was preaching in Dijon, she attended one of his preachings, and became very close friends with him. He actually became her spiritual director. And Francis kind of helped Jane set up an order for women, kind of like a religious order for women who were rejected from other orders, due to various reasons like age or ill health or things like that. So this community became known as the Congregation of the Visitation. And, Francis de Sales had a hand in, of course, starting this and getting it going. Jane worked to find a house, of course, for the women who had nowhere else to go. She continued to care for her own children, even now devoted to this community. And she would often counsel them even in adulthood, as they were, had issues with spiritual matters and things like that. After St. Francis de Sales died, she got a new spiritual director who happened to be none other than Vincent de Paul. So very, very holy spiritual directors that Jane was able to have over the course of her life. Her order soon grew to 13 houses, but then eventually, by her death, it was up to 86 houses. In the year 1641, she passed away at the age of 69, and was beatified by Pope Benedict XIV in 1751, and then canonized by Pope Clement XIII in 1767. And by the time she was canonized in 1767, her order had grown to 164 houses. So, a very large, very vibrant community by this point. And her feast day is on August the 12th. So the next saint that we have, actually saints, it's a joint feast day, is Saints Pontian and Hippolytus. So starting with Saint Hippolytus, he was born around the year 170, give or take. He was a presbyter of Rome, so a priest of Rome during the reign of Pope Zephyrinus, who reigned from 199 to 217. And Hippolytus was known as a very eloquent preacher. And this comes from Origen, one of the church fathers who heard him preach, was very impressed with him. However, he was also not really a fan of Pope Zephyrinus, and he actually accused him of being too soft on modalists. So the modalist movement is a heresy which basically believes that the Father and Son are simply different names for the same person. So Sometimes you'll see this nowadays, people trying to describe the Trinity, and you might hear people try to describe the Trinity as, it's like how a father can be father, son, and say uncle he's one person, but, he can be these three different things to three different people.
That's modalism, Patrick!
What?
Modalism, an ancient heresy confessed by teachers such as Noetus and Sibelius, which espouses that God is not three distinct persons, but that he merely reveals himself in three different forms.
The modalist heresy was kind of vibrant during the reign of Pope Zephyrinus, and he was obviously against it. He was a staunch Trinitarian. However, Hippolytus didn't think that he was hard enough on them. He thought he was being a little too soft on these modalists. So it was this and also other issues that Hippolytus continued to find with the Pope. He was upset that they would give absolution to grave sins like adultery. He was a little more hardcore in thinking that grave sins, that shouldn't be grave sins shouldn't be absolved so easily or something like that. So he was very hardcore, very staunch. Ultra-conservative of this time, and due to these issues, Hippolytus decided that the Pope's doesn't seem to be leading the flock the way that they should be led, so I'm going to declare myself Pope. So Hippolytus became an anti-pope during the reign of Zephyrinus, and he combated Zephyrinus and all of his successors, was continuously a thorn in the side of the Roman pontiffs as this anti-pope, kind of preaching his own version of the truth, in his kind of own schismatic branch of the church. So Zephyrinus eventually passed away, was succeeded by Calixtus I, then finally Urban I, and then by Pontian. So throughout each of these popes, Hippolytus continued to be an anti-pope. So now we'll switch over to Pontian. So Saint Pontian was born sometime in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. We're not exactly sure when. However, we do know that he became pope by the year 230 after Pope Urban I had died. And he was a fierce defender of the Trinity, against the modalists, which again his successors also were. Just that there were certain accusations, of course, that they weren't doing it well enough. But Pontian was a very fierce defender of the Trinity, and he condemned Origen, who we mentioned earlier. He condemned Origen for his heretical views. Origen believed in things like the pre-existence of souls and universal salvation, which, of course, Pontian didn't believe was part of the truth. So this is one of the reasons why Origen is one of the few saints, along with Tertullian, who they're part of the church fathers but aren't considered saints because they had some views that were kind of out of step with most of the other fathers and the popes. So Pontian, became pope, and of course had to deal with this Hippolytus guy who was kind of being really frustrating as an anti-pope. Things changed a bit in the year 235 when Roman general Maximilian Thrax came to power as the new emperor. So, quick history, side tangent. The 3rd century in the Roman Empire was a period that is commonly known as the crisis of the 3rd century, which went from roughly 235 to 284. So in 235, the Roman Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated, and with his death, there's a lot of controversies as to who would rule. You had all these breakaway states and all of these generals, and a lot of invasions by barbarians and things like that. So there was a lot of social and military issues going on in the Roman Empire. So you'd have all these different generals who would gain power, declare themselves emperor, get deposed within a year or two. And for many, many years, this continued to go on. And the Roman Empire was just in a really dark state. So that's all just to say, this kind of was going on. It finally ended in 284 when Diocletian came to power and, of course, really stabilized the empire before Constantine took over, legalized Christianity, and the rest is history. But this General Maximinus Thrax was a short-lived emperor, but came to power. Kind of at the early point in this crisis of the 3rd century. And one of the first things that he did was order the arrest of all Christian leaders and just ordered a persecution of the church. So both Pope Pontian and Antipope Hippolytus, both being very vocal and very visible leaders of two sects of the church in a way, they were both arrested under this order and both sent to hard labor at the mines in Sardinia, on the island of Sardinia. So it was actually here that Hippolytus and Pontian, kind of now both brothers in prison, kind of started to warm up to each other a bit. And Hippolytus actually recanted his schism in the presence of the Pope and became back into full communion with the church. Pontian became the first pope to resign during this time so that others could kind of continue to govern, because he didn't think he could effectively, obviously, lead the church from prison. So he figured if he resigned, then somebody else would be able to take over and continue leading, Christ's flock. So both of these men died as martyrs. Hippolytus now reconciled to the church, and Pontian as a former pope who, was put to death in these mines. So they're both martyred at Sardinia, and their feast day is held to be on the same day, August the 13th, which is very ironic given the circumstances of most of their lives. It just goes to show kind of like the power of kind of the ability that they were able to reconcile themselves near their death. So the next saint that we have is Saint Maximilian Kolbe. So Saint Maximilian Kolbe was born Raymond Kolbe on the 8th of January in the year 1894 in Zduńska Wola, which is in Poland, but at this point in time, Poland was ruled by the Russian Empire. So technically this is in Russia, but the Russian-controlled Poland. So his father was German and his mother was Polish. And he grew up in a very poor family. His father was actually arrested and hanged in the year 1914 as a traitor because he was part of the Polish independence movement. Raymond was very strongly religious from a very early age, and it's reported they saw a vision of the Virgin Mary as a child. And as he put it, quote, "That night I asked the Mother of God what was to become of me, a child of faith. Then she came to me holding two crowns, one white and the other red. She asked me if I was willing to accept either of these crowns. The white one meant that I should preserve in purity, and the red one that I should become a martyr. I said that I would accept them both." So from a very early age, through this vision, he started to have some inkling as to what his path would be in life. At the age of 13, he and his brother left home to join the conventual Franciscans in Lviv, which was at that point, it's modern-day Ukraine, but at that point it was part of Poland. He was given the religious name Maximilian in 1910, and then became a monk in 1914. In 1915, he got his doctorate of philosophy at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and then doctorate of theology in 1919. And also in 1919, he was ordained and then returned to Poland to minister. He actively worked to convert sinners and enemies of the church, kind of during his early years. He had a strong devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and became a part of what was called the Militia Immaculata, the Immaculata Friars. In 1931, he went to Japan and founded a monastery in the outskirts of Nagasaki. And another quick side tangent, just one of my personal interests, is actually during this time he had a run-in with Takashi Nagai, who was a Japanese man who had converted to Catholicism from atheism. And Takashi Nagai was actually present at the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, which I'm actually recording this on August 9th, 88th anniversary of that event. Takashi Nagai, he was a radiologist, he was a doctor. I'll probably talk about him more at some point when we actually he's only a servant of God right now, so he doesn't technically have a feast day, but I'm sure I'll talk about him more at some point. But, he was a radiologist and survived the atomic bombing, and later in life kind of came down with, a very aggressive form of cancer due to his work as a radiologist. There was a lot of radiological stuff going on. One of the people that he prayed to was Father Kolbe, who he had met back in the 1930s, who at that point he hadn't known about his martyrdom or any of that. He just remembered this Father Kolbe and felt the call to pray to him. Although they only met once in life, they kind of had this spiritual connection, between them. But getting back to Maximilian Kolbe, he returned to Poland in the year 1936 due to some illness that he had. His friary was in Niepokalanów in Poland, and this friary was, at this point in time, was growing very rapidly. It went from 18 to 650 friars over just a couple of years. He was arrested in the year 1939 by the Nazis right after they invaded Poland. However, he was only kept in custody for a couple of months before he was released, and went back to his monastery. And it was during this time that a lot of refugees and Jews came to his monastery to hide from the Nazis. It said that as many as up to 3,000 refugees, roughly 1,500 of those were Jews, were hidden in this monastery during this time. The newspaper that the Immaculata Friars that they produced, which was known as the Night of the Immaculate, published a scathing criticism of the Nazis in 1941, which Maximilian Kolbe probably didn't pen, but again, being part of his newspaper, it did hold views that his order believed, right? So the newspaper said, quote, "No one in the world can change truth. What we can do and should do is to seek truth and to serve it when we have found it. The real conflict is the inner conflict. Beyond the armies of occupation and the hecatombs of extermination camps, there are two irreconcilable enemies in the depths of every soul, good and evil, sin and love. And what use are the victories on the battlefield if we ourselves are defeated in our innermost personal selves?" So it was kind of like this kind of critique of Nazi ideology in a more secretive way, but still kind of speaking to that. However, The Nazis were very clear that they realized that this was kind of an affront to what they believed. And in 1941, he was arrested by the Gestapo for hiding Jews and then sent to Auschwitz. So in Auschwitz, he was, of course, put through very awful conditions. However, he remained steadfastly loyal to the faith, even amidst the conditions. He specifically was worked very harshly in kind of the work camp portion of Auschwitz. And there was kind of an ex-criminal who they had the nickname Bloody Crot, who was kind of in charge of some of the prisoners, including him. And this man, he singled out Maximilian Kolbe and, kind of would make him do the most humiliating and difficult work. So he was really put through some really brutal stuff, but continued to hold fast and try to serve as a light amidst all this darkness. Maximilian was known for his humility here, even when recovering from some of these abuses, thrown at him by this Bloody Crot guy. He even offered his meager rations for others, so he would forego meals just so others could eat more. In July of 1941, 3 prisoners escaped, and kind of as retaliation for this event, the guards singled out 10 men to be starved to death, to kind of be put in a bunker and starved to death. So one of these men was a Polish man by the name of Franciszek Gigowniczek, and he was selected. However, as they were kind of dragging him away, he cried out for his wife and child. That he didn't want to have to leave them and leave them alone without him after his death. So hearing this, Maximilian Kolbe, he volunteered to take the man's place. He was quoted with saying, quote, "I am a Catholic priest from Poland. I would like to take his place because he has a wife and children." So the guards are very surprised by this. This kind of took them off guard. They didn't expect somebody to volunteer to die basically in the place of another man, but they did allow it. And Franciszek is recorded with saying, quote, "I could only thank him with my eyes. I was stunned and could hardly grasp what was going on. The immensity of it. I, the condemned, am to live and someone else willingly and voluntarily offers his life for me, a stranger. Is this some dream? I was put back into my place without having had time to say anything to Maximilian. I was saved. I now owe him the fact that I could tell you all this. The news quickly spread all around the camp. It was the first and the last time that such an incident happened in the whole history of Auschwitz." So Maximilian Kolbe and the other men who were to be starved were brought to a bunker. And, during the days, before they began dying, it said that he led them in prayer and song to Mary and kind of tried his best to kind of keep their spirits up despite what was happening to them. It's recorded of this event, quote, "The 10 condemned to death went through terrible days. From the underground cell in which they were shut up, there continually arose the echoes of prayers and canticles. The man in charge of emptying the buckets of urine found them always empty. Thirst drove the prisoners to drink the contents." Just to show you how bad this was. "Since they had grown very weak, prayers were now only whispered. At every inspection, when almost all the others were now lying on the floor, Father Kolbe was seen kneeling or standing on the center as he looked cheerfully in the face of the SS men. Father Kolbe never asked for anything and did not complain. Rather, he encouraged the others, saying that the fugitive might be found and they would all be freed. One of the SS guards remarked, 'The priest is really a great man. We have never seen anyone like him.'" So after 2 weeks of this really awful, kind of brutal conditions, all the prisoners had died except Maximilian Kolbe. And the guards wanted to use that bunker for other means, so they had him removed before he starved to death and actually executed him via lethal injection. He didn't resist and accepted his death, with common grace. So the 15th of August, 1941 is when he died, and his remains were cremated and disposed of, kind of unceremoniously. He served as a bit of a light amidst the horrors of Auschwitz, and he was beatified as a confessor of the faith by Pope St. Paul VI in 1971, and canonized by Pope St. John Paul II in 1981. And the man whose life he had saved, Franciszek, actually was there in attendance at his canonization. And his feast day is on August the 14th. So the final saint that we have today is Saint Stephen of Hungary. So Saint Stephen was born around the year 975 in Esztergom in Hungary. His birth name was Vike, and his father was Geza and his mother Sarolt, and his mother was said to have had a vision, before Stephen was born, from Saint Stephen the martyr, saying that she would bear a son who would evangelize the land. At this point, most of Hungary was pagan, still very much rooted in the pagan ways, and it was Geza and Sarolt who were kind of among the first two to kind of convert and start the process of Christianizing Hungary. So both Saint Stephen's father and mother were converted to Christianity by Saint Adalbert of Prague, who was Bishop of Prague at this time, and Vike himself was born baptized around the year 985 and given the name Stephen as his Christian name. So his father worked to convert the Hungarians to Christianity, and as Stephen grew up and became a adult in his own right, he also assisted in a lot of these duties. In around the year 995, he married Gisela of Bavaria, who was the daughter of Henry II, who was Duke of Bavaria at this time, Bavaria being part of the Holy Roman Empire. And Henry himself eventually became the Holy Roman Emperor, and is the only Holy Roman Emperor who actually was canonized as a saint. So very saintly father-in-law for a very saintly man in Stephen. In 997, Stephen's father passed away. So Stephen became the Grand Prince of the Hungarians. And he fought many wars. A lot of pretenders from his family, also rivals. However, Stephen managed to emerge victorious. He became a king in his own right around the year 1180 as the first king of Hungary. And he had a very close friendship, of course, with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was his father-in-law, and also Pope Sylvester II, who had him consecrated as king. And it was through this act that Hungary went from a very tribal state to a proper Christian kind of feudal kingdom. As king, Stephen worked tirelessly for the conversion of his people. He created dioceses. He created the Diocese of Hungary. He started founding a lot of monasteries and also brought in missionary priests to help evangelize the people. He instituted laws which forbade pagan practices and encouraged Christian ones. And he also was very strongly devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary. He was very generous with the poor. He fought primarily defensive wars throughout his reign, and also very diligent in his duties and his role as king. He only had one son who survived a childhood, that being Emmerich. However, Emmerich died died while Stephen was still alive. So before Emmerich could become king in his own right. After his son's death in the year 1031, Stephen, his health started to decline, and just kind of dealing with succession issues now that he didn't have his son to take over for him. And he delivered his final words to Hungary on the 15th of August in 1038. And he entrusted them kind of with continuing to spread the faith even in his absence. And his final prayer was said to be to the Blessed Virgin Mary, quote, "O thee, O Queen of Heaven, and to thy guardianship, I commend the Holy Church, all the bishops and the clergy, the whole kingdom, its rulers and inhabitants, but before all I commend my soul to thy care." And he eventually died on this feast of the Assumption in the year 1038. In the year 1083, he was canonized by Pope St. Gregory VII, along with his son Emmerich, who also became Saint Emmerich at this time. And his feast day is on August the 16th. And that's all we have in the way of saints. However, I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that August the 15th is the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So it's a holy day of obligation. So, get to go to church an extra day this week. Always a fun thing to do. So hope you all have a blessed week, blessed Feast of the Assumption. And I will see you all next week for our next edition of Saints of the Week. God bless.